we'll go through and we'll see Romans chapter 11 in verse 6. We'll kind of start there as a starting point. And we'll see that it says, just as our verse to get started on with this topical verse. And then since we're going through this today, anytime that you want to bring something up or you want to ask a question or make a comment or anything, you can go ahead and say something at any point. We won't leave it to the end for questions. It's just at any time. But we see in Romans chapter 11, verse 6 says, and if by grace, then is it no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then is it no more grace, otherwise work is no more work. And then it goes on. Just mentioning this, that's kind of where we're starting out, just looking at that. But grace, a quick definition, is kind of unmerited favor that you didn't earn. You didn't do the work, therefore you benefit from it, and you didn't deserve it. So that's the idea of unmerited favor. So we're going to start out and we're going to go back and look at the idea of grace, just as we went through on Wednesday. We looked at the idea of law or commandments, in time past, how that worked and how it came about and everything else. If we look all the way back at Genesis chapter 6, we'll kind of start there. We're looking at that time before the dispensation of promise. We're looking at Genesis chapter 6, based on Galatians 3, talking about how the promises were given to Abraham. So we'll even go back before Abraham. And we'll look at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 7. And what we see here is, let's see if we can find it. Yeah. Genesis chapter 6, verse 7 talks about the idea of there's some grace here. And what it says is in verse 7, and the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So we see there in verse 8, it says that Noah found grace. So it's not that Jesus died on the cross and paid for his sins or anything. This event didn't happen yet. Not in Genesis 6 it didn't. So it wasn't that Noah was what Paul is, and nothing like that. There's, as far as the progressive revelation of God's timeline, that's a long ways away from Genesis 6. But what we find here is grace. We find that Noah in verse 8 found it. Noah found grace. And how does Noah find grace? We see in verse 9 says that Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. So we're seeing that he walks with God. He's just. He's doing things in order to find the grace. There's a performance that he's doing. Noah is not yet at the point where Moses is, even in the progressive revelation of things, where he's doing 613 points of law. That's not even there yet. But we are finding that Noah is doing things. He's got something that he's orienting himself to do. And even if you look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, you find a little bit more detail about Noah. And in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, just to learn more, just to understand, of course, we're not going there, we're going to obey Peter or anything, but we're going to learn from him. And we see in 2 Peter, chapter 2, verse 5, goes on to read here. That says, and spare not the old world, but save Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So you see a little more detail about who Noah is, what he's done. And not only was he just, not only did he walk with God, he was a preacher of righteousness during a time where the whole world is completely sinful. And through his being a preacher of righteousness and walking godly and being a just man and being a perfect man, being perfect as in you're mature, that's another synonymous word with perfect. He's doing all these things and he's finding grace with the Lord.
Now, do they literally mean he is the eighth person?
When they're saying that here, not so much the eighth person, but I think in the means of generations.
Like eighth generation?
Yeah, that type of a thing. But they are saying the eighth person, yeah, because there's going to be a lot more going on.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. it's going to go on from there. But yeah, the eighth person, there's more into it than that.
Okay.
I'm gonna,
I'll read it.
yeah. But I'll want to dive deeper into that, a little bit later. But the eighth person, it's probably saying a lot more into it than this. But what we're seeing about Noah is that he is going forward and he's doing certain performances during a time where the world is literally acting out and rebelling against what God said to do and God's commandments, and times during and even at the dispensation of promise, God deals with individuals. He deals with Abraham, he deals with Job, he deals with Isaac, he deals with Abel, he deals with Cain and Abel, deals with Adam and Eve, deals with individuals rather than the entire mankind like he's looking to do with today. So he's dealing with individuals. In this case, he's dealing with Noah, and Noah is finding the grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He finds it. So it's not that it's something that's being poured out. He goes and he finds it.
He's earning it.
Yeah. So we see that there amongst this certain time. So we see that in Genesis chapter 6. In verse 7, and we see why in verse 8 and verse 9. And this is the kind of idea that moves along in the scriptures before we get to where we are today. And if you look even further, Exodus chapter 33, verse 17. As it continues on, and you move on with different people at different times, but you're still in prophecy. And we're looking at ideas of seeing the concept of grace. Exodus chapter 33, verse 17. We get there, and we're seeing here when God's talking to Moses. It says, and the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight. And I know thee, by name. And then it goes on from there. But you're seeing what God is saying to Moses. And Moses is, someone that went out actually, and as you know, through the history of everything in the Bible that has happened in the book of Exodus and even prior to that, that Moses has gone forth. He's killed an Egyptian. He's done all these things, but yet he goes forth, and in his performance, he's finding grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so we see this, or in the sight of the Lord, I should say. But he's finding it. It's not being poured out. It's not being dispensed. It's not, he's going and he's finding it. Whereas today, you can go to, in the dispensation of grace, you can go into a prison where there's mass murderers and say, hey, grace is being poured out to you right now. And of course, you explain to me, we'll get into that a little bit as to the means, as to the why, as to the how, as to the who. We'll get to that in just a moment. And of course, we kind of already know the answers. But here they're finding it. This is Noah, this is Moses. In prophecy, they're going and they're finding it. They're kind of like the exception to the rule almost. They're finding this grace in which God is talking to them, God is dealing with them, God is working with them, God is giving them instructions. With Noah, he's essentially saying, look, I'm going to flood this earth. This earth is wicked. This earth is filled with people who are rebellious. But with you found grace with me, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you to go ahead and build an ark. And so you're finding things like this. And with Moses, he's when you think about the Old Testament, you always think of a God that is nothing but wrathful and vengeful and angry and so on and so forth. But you're finding that God is actually doing a lot of graceful things, and merciful things in the Old Testament. You're finding that he could have destroyed Israel 500,000 times for all the wicked things they did and all the rebellious things that they had done and all the wicked gods that they had worshipped, false gods that they had worshipped. Yet he didn't do that, and his law said that he could. They had entered into a covenant where God had every right to destroy Israel over and over and over again, and yet he was graceful enough not to do so. We see just examples of this through the Bible here. Even the idea that God, as he in the dispensation of promise, we know that as we had studied last week, building on what we had learned in, say, on Wednesday, that because of transgressions, God had given them the law. As this new nation is coming about from their Egyptian exodus, from Egypt, and they're coming out into the wilderness. There's all these transgressions are abounding. You know that from 1 Corinthians, all of chapter 10, just about. And so they go forth, and they're constantly sinning. God sets up these 613 points of law. And, even through that, at that point in time, in the dispensation of law, coming out of the dispensation of promise, even giving them laws to obey was a gracious thing. Of course, that's not for us to do today, but for them, different people at different times with a different purpose and God's timeline, that was a gracious thing to do. They needed structure. They needed order. If they had continued in their rebelliousness, if they had continued without a set of commands, a set of laws, 613 points of law, their transgressions would continue to run out of order. And so God gave them 613 points of law, and that for them was a gracious thing, was a right thing to do. And yet all they had to do is still say, we can't obey all this. We need to depend on you. And that was the point of the law, was to, bring them to God, have them depend on God. And that even worked out for them, later, so to speak. So God's continuously and wisely setting up ways to be merciful and graceful to people. So we see that there. And then even Jeremiah talks about all of this in Exodus chapter 33, going through the wilderness with Moses and everything else. It's Jeremiah 31, verse 8. And he kind of talks about this in that verse about Moses and Israel in the wilderness. But it's Jeremiah 31. And if we turn there in verse 8, what we're going to see here is the mentioning of this. Let's get there real quick. And what you see here is Jeremiah 31, verse 8. Let me find it here. And he goes on to say that, behold, I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame, the woman with child, and her that trail up the child together. A great company shall return hither. Let's see if we can. This is the right one I got here. I think I might have gotten this one a little bit off. Let's see. 32. Let me check if I got that right. Yeah, I think I got the wrong verse, but there's one here that talks about how Israel goes through, and they do have, there's at 18. Well, I think I might have gotten this verse off a little bit, but they do go through talking about how there is grace given to them through the fact of them going through the wilderness that they go through with Moses. And I might have just been off by a verse or two here when I was writing all this down. And see if I can find, is it, yeah, I think I was off on this, but we'll come back to that in a minute. It was pretty much through Moses, just as we're seeing it through Noah, that we're seeing that there's this grace that they're finding. But they do have to go and find it. Even as we continually move up the prophecy program, if you look at Ruth, the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verse 2, you're finding Gentiles that join up with Israel. Ruth, chapter 2, verse 2, the idea of that we see is that they join up and they become a part of, or Ruth joins up with what Israel has in store. It becomes a part of, Israel and all that they're doing in prophecy. So get there as well. And what we find when we get to this, just get there. Oops. Yeah, we're pretty much seeing, where'd it go? Is that when in Ruth 2:2, you're seeing that Moabitess, she's from Moab, and she, as a Gentile, comes in and joins up with what's happening in this plan as well. She too, because of her obedience and her willingness to stay with everybody, joins up with Israel and fails or doesn't fail to leave. She does this here. She finds grace. She finds it just as just as Noah has, just as David has. We'll get to David in a minute. Just as Moses has, she finds grace by being obedient to what's being said in the prophecy program. And that's Ruth chapter 2, verse 2. I just want to give that up for you there. But as it continues on, you continue to see in this Old Testament program, in the prophecy program, you're finding people finding grace. Just the fact that grace is not only mentioned in the dispensation of grace, but you're seeing how the fact that it's there and to whom it's being given to those that find it. And as they go through to find it, they're doing things that are right. And as they do so, it's happening according to the fact that they're having faith in God and his laws and his covenants and the things that he's saying to have, or in the dispensation of promise, they're having faith in the promises that God is promising, or that they're going through. And even before the promise, they're having faith in his commands and in his instructions. And when they do so, that looks good in God's sight, and they find grace accordingly. So we see that there. It continues on, not only with Noah, not only with Moses, not only with Ruth, but if we look even at Psalm 84, verse 11. Now we're moving on to what I had mentioned briefly, King David. As you go through this Old Testament, you find that there is grace, but people have to find it. And yet God is a graceful, merciful, loving God during Old Testament times, just as he is. God is always the same, but how he deals with mankind is differently. So in Psalm 84, verse 11, get there as well. And what we see here says, for the Lord God is the sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. So again, you're seeing the idea that the Lord will give grace and glory, but the catch, so to speak, no good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. So you got to walk uprightly in order to get that grace, and that's covenant standing. That's conditional, and that's how it should be in prophecy. We find this here. And so we're seeing this being said here, and then as it continues on, we know it's the idea of King David. We're moving into along God's timeline. We're looking at different people where God will, be gracious and merciful, and so we're seeing this play out here, and it's all to serve Him. It's all for God and His glory. We say that King David, based on covenant standing, and we can read all about these covenant standings in Leviticus chapter 26, 27, and 28. The whole chapter is talking about blessings and cursings and everything based on a covenant. And then it goes on to even talk about with King David and the issues that he had, where he had actually watched Bathsheba, taken her, and sent her husband to death so that he could have Bathsheba for himself. As a result, he was living under law, and those laws, he could be punishable by death, and should have been. But we find in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 3, something that occurred as a result, or something that happened instead. That David was a man after God's own heart, and yet was sinful, had committed sin, and that's not a contradiction in terms. That's just that he has a sin-cursed nature and was a man after God's own heart. We see in verse 3 of Isaiah 55, he says that, incline your ear and come unto me, hear, and your soul shall live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies of David. And so, of course, as he goes on, and this is being said in Isaiah 55:3, you're seeing a phrase there, a phrase or a term that's called the sure mercies of David. And that's something where you're finding grace being extended to someone who deserves to be punished under law, if not murdered, if not killed, and so on, for the things that he's done. Instead, he's being shown the sure mercies of David. Specifically, this is a terminology given to King David, in which this is what later leads on to what you find in Romans. But this happens here, talking about the sure mercies of David. It even gets said in Acts chapter 13. If you look at Acts chapter 13, verse 33. Talking again about the sure mercies of David as we're moving along God's timeline from Noah, Moses, Ruth. You see in King David's time. And these are not everybody in the Old Testament, so I'm kind of going through things a little bit quickly, picking out specific people. There's more than this, so I don't want to limit it to just who we're talking about here. More so, I want to show the examples of grace that we're looking at. But the fact is, they're going out and they're finding it. So in Acts chapter 13, and we see in verse 33, it says that God hath fulfilled the same unto us, their children, in that he hath raised up Jesus again. As it is also written in the second Psalm, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. and as concerning that he raised him up from the dead, now no more to return to corruption. He said on this wise, I will give you the sure mercies of David. Wherefore he saith also in another psalm, thou shalt not suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. For David, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell on sleep and was laid unto his fathers and saw corruption. And that's normal. But he whom God raised again saw no corruption. Be it known unto you, therefore, men and brethren, that through this man is preached unto you the forgiveness of sin in Jesus Christ. And then it goes on to explain that, and by him all that believe are justified from all things that from which ye could not be justified by the law of Moses. Explaining, David and the sure mercies of David and the Lord Jesus Christ, and how you're justified by him, not the works of the law. And so we're seeing this play out here, but you do see the sure mercies of David in verse 34 mentioned again, just as it's mentioned in Isaiah 55. And this is an explanation of grace that was given to David in spite of what he did and who he was. So we're seeing this take place here. And if we look at the Romans, now this is why it comes up, Romans chapter 4, verse 7. Romans chapter 4, verse 7, as Paul goes through and he has this book under inspiration, written, this is where we see, he says, even as David also described the blessedness, verse 6, the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputeth righteousness without works, saying in verse 7, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. So he goes forth and he's kind of quoting David on this. One of the Psalms, I believe Psalm 32, goes through and explains that this is what David is saying. And he's saying this because this is an example of the sure mercies of David. David is the one who goes through and says, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. People will say, well, how could that happen to King David? How has this happened? And they had 613 laws. They had a program where they could sacrifice a bull or a goat or whatever it may be for sin. But David had something more given to him. And it was something that he had found by being who he was, a man after God's own heart. And nonetheless, you're seeing an example of grace from God, who is loving, merciful, graceful. And yet, we don't want to just limit it to that, because a lot of different religious groups will say God is love, and therefore everything can be whatever you want it to be, and that's their excuse they use to manipulate what they want you to think God is. God is love, as we know this from 1 John 4 and so on and so forth. He's gracious, he's merciful, and everything else, but he also has a sense of justice, wisdom, truth, and that demands certain things to take place, which is why we find what we find, that God executes vengeance and will do so in the book of Revelation. And that even when we go through Paul's epistles, he doesn't say, let yourself be a doormat or things like this. There are instructions given so that we understand how things are supposed to take place according to Paul's epistles and specific instructions. So we see that in Romans 4, going back to King David, that these are the things that Paul writes based on the things that David said. And he's using it for the case for God's grace in Romans chapter 4. So we see that there. And this actually comes through, if we look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, in verse 12. This is actually where this is all coming about. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. I think it's going to be in verse 7. I'm sorry, 2 Samuel 7, verse 12. Got that mixed up. 2 Samuel 7:12. What we see here, 7:12 reads that, and when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. For my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words, and according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak unto David. So you're seeing more built on what we had kind of looked at roughly last week with Genesis chapter 12. This is building on these things that are occurring, and this is kind of called more so the Davidic covenant. But you're seeing more of this grace being poured out to David, and it all plays out for the glory of God. But this is just more examples of how this is working out, an example of God's grace. And you're finding people earning it, people finding it. And this is working out for there. So we look at things like this, and yet we find just more examples of how in the Old Testament, you're not finding God to be this bitter, upset, vengeful God who just wants to kill everybody and hates everybody, and just nothing like that at all. We're finding that God is a compassionate, merciful, he's full of grace, and he's in dealing with Israel and everybody in that Old Testament time period. There's different dispensations during that time. If we look at Psalm 78:38, for example, you'll see this being spoken of God like this. Psalm 78:38. The example to understand God, whether it be the dispensation of promise, the dispensation of law, dispensation of course, grace, dispensation of the kingdom, or dispensation of the fullness of times, we're seeing an example being laid out, say, in the dispensation of law or promise, a description. In Psalm 78, verse 38, it goes on to read, and he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath. This is more so talking about Israel and all the things that they did, and all the times he could have destroyed Israel for all their silliness and their foolishness and their griping and their whining and their crying in the wilderness and every other way that they had gone and worshiped false gods and created idolatry. If you read the Bible from front to back, you'll see there's so many times Israel turned away from God. God had every right under their agreement, aka their covenant, aka their Old Testament. He had every right to destroy them, and yet he turned his back, as we see here in verse 38. He turned his anger, I should turn his back, turned his anger away, and did not stir up all his wrath. So he maybe stirred up the right amount of wrath to teach them a lesson, whatever it may be, whatever that lesson was. But he didn't pour it out in full. Otherwise, you'd read how Israel is completely annihilated, destroyed, whatever it may be, and you don't find that. So God is gracious, God is merciful, God is loving, God is caring to do what needs to be done in an incredibly wise way. And you never hear this being taught about God when you're studying the Old Testament. And so we're building on the understanding that there was grace in the Old Testament with God. And we're reading about this, and we see this here. So we see this here. If you look at Psalm 145, while we're here in the Psalm, Psalm 145, verse 8. As we continue on looking at some examples or evidence or verses dealing with grace. Psalm 145 and verse 8 goes on to describe explanations or examples. It says that the Lord is gracious. And we see it again, more descriptions of how others viewed the Lord while being under law, while being in an agreement or a testament with him. And they said, The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger and of great mercy. The Lord is good to all. His tender mercies are over all his works. All thy works shall praise thee, O Lord, and thy saints shall bless thee. And then, of course, they say, they shall speak of the glory of thy kingdom. So again, we're looking at that earthly kingdom. We're seeing it's all about prophecy under law, Israel. So we're getting all the understandings of where it all fits. But we're seeing that nonetheless, they're saying, God, this is a very gracious God we have here. They're saying this when you read it in the Psalms, and when you read it, going back to Genesis and Noah and Ruth and Moses and so on. Of course, it's all talking about different dispensations, whether it's the dispensation of promise, dispensation of law. You're seeing it's not us. It's not the dispensation of grace. That's yet and upcoming. But nonetheless, we're seeing how it is all about God's grace nonetheless. So it's people are finding it through their performance, through their behavior, through what they need to be doing. As they have faith in covenants, as they have faith in testaments, and faith in rules and laws, they're finding it. And yet these people aren't perfect, and yet they're finding grace. So we see that there. And so he still hates sin. God still hates sin. Leaves room for justice, wrath, anger, and will come in this prophecy program, as it's mentioned, through all sorts of different books. He will come in Revelation 19:11 to make war and wrath, bring about earthquakes and locusts and storms and everything and so forth. He will make war with the Antichrist and everything else. Yet we're finding grace. Even when that happens, that's graceful. And we're going to get to that just now. Grace, and so as we look at the ages to come, you've got the little flock of Israel. You've got the believers, believing Gentiles that either join up with Israel or on their own they understand that they need to believe in the living God. We see there in, say, Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, what God says to them through Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 12, in verse 10, mentions, if you get there, it's going to be talking about what happens to not only the house of David. So again, we're mentioning King David, or the house of David, that we saw in 2 Samuel 7. But it's going back to David and everyone else. And it's also talking about the inhabitants of Jerusalem during the future time. And it says there, and I will, from Zechariah's viewpoint, it's going to happen in the future, I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. But now he will pour out the spirit of grace, and he'll do so. And it's going to be a graceful thing to set up the kingdom. It's going to be a graceful thing to fulfill and to carry out Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, to set up blessings and then descendants and inheritance and everything else that we find in Genesis 12 for Israel. And it's going to be a graceful thing that he sets all this up, and he goes through and he does all this. Grace is prophesied in the Old Testament. Even if you look at Luke chapter 1 in verse 68. In Luke chapter 1, verse 68. And we see that Jesus comes on the scene. Luke chapter 1, verse 68, and we're seeing that it's graceful to have a Messiah. It's graceful that he shows up, and that this is all part of the prophecy program, and that this is all part of prophecy. It says there that blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he hath visited and redeemed his people, that's Israel, and hath raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. Again, mentioning David. And he, as he spake by the mouth of his holy prophets, which have been since the world began. So, of course, we're not where we are. We're in a program which was hid since the world began, but now revealed. Yeah, we're seeing it's graceful that they have their Messiah. The Messiah will come and take away Israel's sin. And their sin will be everything from either being in agreement with the Antichrist, mark of the beast, everything else, and a lot more. He'll destroy all these things, destroy all these idolatrous issues and images that'll be around. He'll destroy all these things. He'll make war with these things. He'll destroy the Antichrist. That'll be a gracious thing that he does that, and then brings in the kingdom and fulfills all that for the little flock. If we look even at what Peter has to say, this is how we know things are so different. If we look at 1 Peter chapter 1, as we go into the ages to come. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10. And we go through there. First Peter chapter 1, verse 10 goes on to talk about the little flock, or this is written to the little flock, and anyone else who reads it, in the ages to come. It's going to say, of which salvation the prophets have inquired and searched diligently, who prophesied of the grace that should come unto you. So again, he's mentioning that there's going to be this grace that should come, a future event of grace. And that's going to be that grace where we know from Romans 11 talks about how God will have a Savior come and take away sin from Israel. All that sin that's in there, mark of the beast, Antichrist, economic system, idolatrous images being worshipped, and everything that's counter to the prophetic program of God, that'll be all removed. We also see there him mentioning so much more in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, that familiar verse. God will also lift the entire curse of sin. We know that from Isaiah chapter 11. I'll leave that whole entire chapter for you to read, how the entire curse of sin will just be lifted off the earth. And that's a graceful thing. It's a very graceful thing, but we won't be here for that. But nonetheless, that's an example in the ages to come of God's grace in prophecy. And so we see that in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 about the grace that should come and that will come for them. And even in verse 13, it says, wherefore, in 1 Peter 1, verse 13, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that's when it's to come, at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So when people read prophecy with mystery, and they mix mystery with prophecy, and they mix the two things up, and they were to say, read Romans through Philemon, or Romans, Ephesians, Galatians, and our books, and then they go and read, say, 1 Peter, and they think that the grace should come at a later time. They're going to mix the timing. They're going to mix the dates. They're going to mix what's happening. They're going to think, well, this grace should happen later. So that means it doesn't happen now. So in mixing the verses, they're going to say, well, I must have to earn something. I must have to do something. I must not really be saved. My salvation must not be set in stone. I must not have, eternal security. Because 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 says it should come later. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13 says it will be given to me at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so they read the verses, they mix their identity, they mix their purpose, they mix their understanding of who they are and when the grace is supposed to come. And they can go easily into Paul's epistles, read all about grace, and wrongly divide the word of truth when it comes to grace. So we see that a lot in different churches, religious groups, radio shows, television shows that have to do with Christianity. So you'll see that there. But if you look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, another reason why people may go to Peter and saying, well, Peter and Paul say the same message. Peter and Paul, let me see if I got that right. I have a lot of things, 4:10. Yeah, okay. Yeah, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. They may say that Peter says the same thing as Paul, or Peter is the same thing as Paul. They may combine the two and go to 1 Peter 1:10, 1 Peter 1:13, because 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 says, as every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So they would read that and they would just say, oh, well, wow, looks like we are all stewards of the manifold grace of God, as Peter says. Therefore, let's do what Peter says. Let's read what Peter says. Let's obey what Peter says, and let's run with what Peter says. Just because he has the word grace and that he's saying we're all stewards of the manifold grace of God. But again, that grace of God in prophecy is going to be that he's going to vanquish all the sin out of Israel, and if not the world, and set up a kingdom for the prophetic program, just as has been prophesied since the world began. We're not in that program. We're in a program that's been hid since the world began, but is now revealed and given to the Apostle Paul. So we see that play out here. And we know that even if we look at Romans chapter 11, verse 25, and we know through our study on Romans, that took us a while to do, verse by verse, Romans 9, 10, and 11 talks about Israel, their past, present, and future. So in Romans chapter 11, verse 25, when Paul talks about Israel, Paul talks about Israel's future. He says this in Romans chapter 11, verse 25. You're looking at grace, God's grace, not only in the past, but also in the future, how people find it. He says, "For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. That blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer." That's very graceful. "And shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins." As concerning, and it continues on from there. But you're seeing it even mentioned by Paul here. So when we see that God gave the law to Moses, that was a graceful thing in their testament there. But even when, and we've read these verses before, Jeremiah 31:31, God writes the law into their hearts. That's what the New Testament is for the little flock of Israel and anyone that joins up with them. That those 613 points of law will be able to be carried out because God will supernaturally write the law into their heart, and they'll be able to carry those laws out supernaturally. And that's Ezekiel 36:25 and Jeremiah 31:31 through 34. I just want to give those verses out, but we won't turn to them, but I'll give those cross references out nonetheless for you to refer to them. And that's a graceful thing too, during the time when God is just merciful, loving, and kind to do what he does. And so when you explain that to people think, well, I thought there was an angry God here, but a nice God now. And God's always been gracious, compassionate, merciful, loving, slow to anger. And God is who God is. As we're understanding how he deals with people at different dispensations at different times. We're seeing that here. God may deal with law, or with people under law in one dispensation. And as we look here, God is now dealing with grace. As we see in Romans chapter 11, we're seeing Paul. Now we're going to look even more. We kind of saved the best for last. Looking at grace rightly divided, we just looked at it through time past, how people had to find it. Noah, Moses, Ruth, King David, and even in the future, as people go through and they join up with the little flock of Israel, they repent, they get water baptized, they confess their sins, they confess that Jesus Christ is God. That's Romans 10, 9 and 10, based on Matthew 12, 32. They get water baptized, and they confess, and they become part of the little flock of Israel. We see that as a part of these things happening in the prophetic program, whether it be time past or ages to come, we see now that rather than being in a dispensation of promise or a dispensation of the kingdom or a dispensation of law, that in this dispensation of grace, it's not that people find it, it's that it's revealed completely, because the devil's trying to hide the fact that when Jesus Christ died on the cross, that's what this whole thing means, is that we're living in a whole dispensation of grace now. And so this is how when we rightly divide the word of truth, we're living in a whole time where God is now pouring out his grace. And it's not because we're so amazing or so wonderful, he wants us to run wild. It's that he wants us to understand that's what the cross means. That's what the death, burial, and resurrection means, is that he's doing so that we can go forth and serve him and his purposes in the dispensation of grace. And of course, in every dispensation, we find people failing to understand the purposes, and we find the devil trying to counterfeit his purposes. And so we find this here, but again, that goes back to Romans chapter 11, verse 6, grace and works. But if we look also at Romans chapter 3, verse 25, Romans chapter 3, verse 25 explains a lot of great detail. A lot of good words in there too, a lot of good $10 words. It says that, actually we'll move up to verse 24. We'll go to Romans 3:24. Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God hath set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. To declare, I say, at this time his righteousness, that he might be just, and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. Whereas boasting then, it is excluded. By what law? Of works, nay, but by the law of faith. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. And it goes on, reads this here in Romans chapter 3. So we see a lot about this here. We look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, another well-quoted, very famous verse, pretty much known everywhere, but the whole point of it, of why we're going here and why it builds up into this, is Ephesians 2:8 goes on to say, for by grace are ye saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And of course, Noah couldn't say this. David couldn't say this, that he was saved, but yet the sure mercies of David, showed a lot of grace, showed a great deal of it. And so that's why the sure mercies of David was something that the little flock could read about and learn something from. And so when we learn from that too, but we're seeing that we're in an entire dispensation where we can go to anybody on planet Earth and explain this to them today. No matter who they are, no matter what they've done, no matter what's happened to them, we can explain that Christ died for their sins. We can give them the good news, the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, and explain it to them. And explain we are living in a dispensation of grace. It's not that God likes sin now. He doesn't. He's, again, the same. He's God. God hasn't changed, but how he deals with man has changed. And we are now living in the calm before the storm. And God will come in Revelation 19:11. He will make war, and he will set up his kingdom and go to war with all those who are against him. But right now, he's set up a dispensation where he allows everybody to come to him. They have to believe in the terms that God has sent us out as ambassadors to go out and tell people. And so we are the ambassadors on the scene right now, dispensing what God is telling us to do, which is information and grace, and this is what we do. So we see that in verse 8. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. It says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. So we're seeing that God does have a plan where we are to go out there and do some good works, and not at all for our salvation, but understanding that we've been saved and we are living in the dispensation of grace, where God does consider right behavior a good thing and wrong behavior a bad thing. And yet he's not going to send down a lightning bolt if we do something bad. But he does allow us to learn and grow and understand what needs to be done, because he's given us a book, a complete book that we can learn and read from and understand it, and therefore go out and do that which is right by God. So, and that's graceful. We see that here. Of course, we know those are the means by grace. We know that grace doesn't come by sacraments or religion or the law. We know that from the book of Galatians. Galatians 2:20, 2:21 talks about that. And so we see that there as well. So we're no more going to go out and try to find grace. We're living in an entire dispensation of it. And staying in Ephesians, if you look at Ephesians chapter 3, verse 1. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 1, Paul goes on to say this. Paul goes on to say, for this cause I, Paul, the prisoner of Jesus Christ for you Gentiles, if ye have heard of the dispensation of the grace of God, which is given me to you word, how that by revelation he made known unto me the mystery, as I wrote afore in few words, whereby when ye read, ye may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ, which in other ages was not made known unto the sons of men. Noah, David, Ruth, Moses, wasn't made known unto them. It says, as it is now revealed unto his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. Now, of course, they found grace as their performance merited it, or as their performance, they found it. It wasn't their entire dispensation, and other people didn't find it in that dispensation. Now it's being poured out to all. And people can choose to believe it or not. And if they don't believe it, they're going off road from what God is doing today. And they're going into other things, which is the devil's lie program. The devil would be thrilled to have everybody in a church somewhere trying to get into the earthly kingdom. The devil would be thrilled if all they did was read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and believe it, ignoring Paul, or mixing Paul, or thinking they belong in somewhere they don't belong. As long as they're not saved, as long as they're not studying and reading and understanding and believing the Bible, that's what the devil wants. So as long as they're believing they're somewhere else, water baptizing, tithing, and doing other things that belong to the kingdom and the prophetic program, and they think that's their identity, spiritual Israel, replacement Israel, literal Israel, all those different theologies we had talked about, instructing those that oppose themselves, then the devil's happy with that. And when we come about and we explain to people, we instruct those that oppose themselves, that's when the devil gets upset. So we see that there, and that's the 2 Corinthians 4, verse 3 and 4 live program that the devil has. So we see that in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 5, which in other ages was not made known unto the sons of men, as it is now revealed unto his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit, that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs, and of the same body and partakers of his promise in Christ by the gospel, whereof I was made a minister according to my works, is not what it says. It says, according to the gift of the grace of God given unto me by the effectual working of his power. And it even says in verse 8, unto me who am less than the least of all saints is this grace given, that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hidden God, who created all things by Jesus Christ. So we see that even all things by Jesus Christ shows that if you think even back to the beginning, it is graceful that God created everything. That's one thing. He created everything in wisdom and righteousness. And that was, the devil ruined that. But what God created is good and gracious. And just think about things, something to that effect. So we see that there. But a lot of people will take grace or the grace message or what Paul is teaching, call it greasy grace, and say that since you're not working to earn salvation, you believe in this cheap grace or this greasy grace or this type of grace where you don't really have any zeal towards God, you don't have any focus on God, you just believe in that that death, burial, and resurrection, and that's it. You don't believe in this or that, you don't believe in earning this, or you don't believe in the laws of God, you don't believe in, and they like to spin it so that they think that you are just skating by or whatever it may be. That's their way of thinking. But it cost the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ our salvation. The blood was spilled for you. Blood was spilled for me. And when we apply that and think that into our common knowledge based on the scriptures rightly divided, we understand that there is someone who died for us, and blood was spilled on our behalf. And that's grace. That's the reality of it. So we see that there, and that we can't. Usually the person saying that will somehow think that their works will merit something better than the cross, and that's insanity. So we took a little bit about finding grace in time past, how grace is even found, how people will find it in ages to come, and how graceful it'll be when God does what he does, merciful, graceful, how God is described as being graceful and merciful, whether it be in the past or in the future, and how even now we're living in an entire dispensation of grace and how that suits God's purposes before he does what he does. So I wanted to go through a quick overview or brush of grace, because we looked at law on Wednesday. Figured we'd look at grace, law and grace, kind of look at the two ideas of it, and see if there's any questions, or kind of go from there based on these topics here. So figured I'd wrap up a little bit early and see if there are any questions or thoughts based on this topic.
I'm glad you made that clarification about what grace was in time past, because it makes it so much clearer that it required works in time past. It required something in time past. It doesn't require it today. It's given freely.
Yeah.
So that's made it pretty clear, at least for me. I mean, I know there was times in time past when grace was given, but it was worked for. It wasn't given freely. You found it because you had to do something to find it. If you're doing something to find grace, you're working, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is consistent with what we know from what the Bible teaches us as far as time passing, but now.
Yeah. A lot of people think that they mix the two. And if you don't rightly divide the scriptures, you kind of think that's what's going on today, is that I'm going to find grace by going to church, paying some tithing, do sacraments, act holy, act self-righteous, or just righteous, whatever they want to call it, act religious. And by doing these things, I'm going to start earning up my grace and earning up my rewards of grace. And you do, when you go out and serve, that's when you're going to give an account for what you do at the judgment seat of Christ, both good and bad, and you're accounted for based on that. But as far as people think that the more I show up at church every week at 10 o'clock in the building on Sunday with people and so on. I mean, if that's what you want to do, you do it, but you do it because you purpose it in your heart, just like 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7 talk about. You do what you do, whatever it is, whether it's right or wrong, because you purpose it in your heart. That's how it should be. And if you're saved, you'll give an account for it. Even if you're lost, you're going to give an account for it. You're just going to give an account at the great white throne rather than at the judgment seat of Christ. And nonetheless, that's the whole point. But grace is not something that you're going to go and try and find it. And it's not that type of thing. It's being freely dispensed right now. You just have to understand the terms. And the terms are the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ being a fully sufficient payment for your sins. So when someone says, well, Christ did 50%, you have to do the other 50%. That's not true. It's the death, burial, and resurrection is absolutely fully sufficient payment for you, for our sins.
Not only is that not true, that's not grace.
Right, it's not grace. Yeah. That means you didn't earn it.
That's right. It's not given to you freely.
Or it's not given to you freely.
You had to do something.
Right. Exactly. So, yeah. Yep. So yeah, that's why we went back. We kind of looked at these different topics, instructing those that oppose themselves, how to study the Bible, law rightly divided, grace rightly divided, revelation rightly divided. We're just looking at different topics every Sunday, every Wednesday. We're looking at different things. We're going to look at different topics just for a little while, kind of dive into the scriptures that helps us study the Bible and see when things are happening in the Bible, different things. Oh, that's why that might be. This is why this is happening the way this is happening. That's what that phrase means. That's what this part means here. So we can go in and read it, and as we dive into it, we understand things a little bit better.
This is a good study because it differentiates what grace is in prophecy and what grace is in mystery.
Yeah. And it's still grace. It's still God.
It's still grace, still God.
Yeah.
It's different people.
Yeah. Different people, different dispensations, different times. And that's why we do these studies, is to kind of give more information, shine more light on certain topics. And even if there's disagreement or you need more understanding, this is just to get you going with it, and you take it from there. You grow, you pick out what's not right according to what you may be studying, and you add to it based on where you are studying, and you grow from there, you go from there, you learn from it. And hopefully, you give an account at the judgment seat of Christ from what we're learning here and what we're doing together, and we all grow together. And let the Bible be the final authority on all that we're doing. So.
Very good.
So, any other thoughts or comments or anything on what we're doing, or questions?
I just wanted to share, I got 1,000 things in my head going around right now that I've been trying to verbalize them about today's study. So I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to say it. I can't get it out.
Okay.
But I will share, a little bit of what kind of came to my mind yesterday. And I guess it's just, grace and scriptures kind of working in my own life and making me see things more clearly. Because I probably would have been one of these people years ago doing what's kind of going on right now. But I've noticed like everything is being pointed out right now. Like, whether it be Facebook or other social media, people are just like tearing stuff apart, like this this new Disney Cruella movie. Like, I've seen people in my own friends list like that's got the things of the devil in it, and they're talking about the devil. Then you've got, the shoes that came out not too long ago. They're devil shoes, and they're glorifying the devil. And I guess it just came to me yesterday, and I was like, people are they're so deceived in themselves, and they're so self-righteous that they don't even see that what they're doing when they point that stuff out is creating more um creating more chaos than it is good, because it's doing nothing. I mean, sin's sin. This is the devil's earth. I mean, it's his. That kind of stuff's going to happen in this kind of sinful world. And, and I got to thinking about it, and I was like, if they put that much energy into trying to spread the gospel and save people and let people's hearts be changed, then it would be different. And they would be doing something more productive than what they're doing right now.
Yeah.
But I just see it, and I'm like, these people, man, I mean, yes, that's crazy. And oh, well, you don't have to watch it if you don't want to, but, you know, everywhere you turn and everything you do, even the people that are posting this, I'm like, y'all celebrate Halloween? I mean, do you think that's Jesus's time to go get candy or something? I mean,
Yeah.
or you watch rated R movies where they're cussing or they're having affairs, and you're watching this kind of thing. Do you not think that's the devil's handiwork? I mean, the devil's everywhere. He's in everything. No matter how clean or how transparent it is, whether it's, you can see it right there that 666 is on her car tag in a movie or something, or somebody's having an affair in another movie. I mean, it's the same thing. It's sin. But you got these people pointing it out and creating a squabble about it when they're not putting any energy into trying to spread the gospel. And
Mhm.
that just came to me. I mean, I just started looking at that like, wow, this is more deception upon more deception, And not only that, the people that are doing it, that have unsaved people following them or listening to what they have to say, all they're doing is making themselves look judgmental. When he already dealt with sin. Sin is dealt with. Everything that's going on is dealt with, but nobody wants to look at sharing the gospel. And I just found that interesting this week, that had that thought.
Yeah. 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 It's good to be judgmental and discerning. That's a good thing on that point. But like you said, it's also more so to get souls saved. It's wiser to see souls saved. It's wiser to go out there with the gospel. So it's all on how we tackle it and handle it. But 1 Timothy 2:4 is what we're here to do as ambassadors, to get the gospel out, make sure people are
Right.
at least they're hearing the gospel, having the gospel presented to them in some way, shape, or form. And in order to get there, you're going to have to, depending on where we're at, we're going to go through a whole mess of sin in order to get to the heart of the matter in one way or another. But yeah, like you said, it's everywhere. And in order to get the gospel to someone, we're going to have to work our way through some issues. It's not that we isolate ourselves away from everyone, but go out there and get the gospel out.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point, Lorraine, because
Leslie.
I'm sorry, Leslie. I think that's a good point, Leslie, because what you're saying is the more you study and the more you become aware of things, the more you see things happening that are less understandable, but you can understand them. They make more sense to you because what you know now compared to what you knew before just makes so much more sense.
Yes.
And being more
Yeah.
aware. Yeah.
Right. I wouldn't have even, and I guess that's me pointing out my own fault. Like, I know, like, I would have been one of them a couple of years ago, just saying stuff like, oh, that's horrible, that movie's horrible, and this is just terrible. But I wouldn't have given anybody the gospel at all. It's like I would have taken it on. Sorry, I got a toddler in here with me.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have thought to give the gospel as a solution to this problem. You know, like, why am I sitting here squabbling about sin that has already been dealt with instead of trying to help these people be saved? You know, some of these people around me, and then once they're saved, let them realize, you know, they need to help others be saved.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that's what it's all about for us today. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a good point to be discerning too. We still want to discern and understand there's a lot of wrong things and what the wrong things are. So it's not that we
Oh, yeah.
so, you know.
It's not like I'm saying that I'm okay with all this and let it be and it'll run amok and be okay.
Yeah.
It's just saying, like, if we would put more energy into, you know, working toward giving the gospel out. You know, I know these people aren't going out and handing out tracts, and they're not doing that kind of thing. They're sitting and squabbling over sin that's been dealt with.
Yeah.
You know, and yes, we need to discern that it is sin, but I just found it kind of counterproductive.
Yeah. 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 Good point. Yeah. That makes sense.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions or anything at all? So yeah. Yeah, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and wrap up here. We'll be back here Wednesday and Sunday. We'll find some more topics. If anyone wants to throw them into the chat room or anything in general, we'll keep going through some topics. Whether it be grace, or law rightly divided, or something totally different that we'll keep moving on to, we'll keep having the topics. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful for you. This was instructive. This gave some more insight that you can kind of go with and run with in your own personal studies. And we'll keep doing more. We'll keep doing more until we go back to verse by verse studies in a certain specific book of the Bible. But yeah, we'll wrap up here, and we'll be back here Wednesday and Sunday. All right, so.
Bye, everybody.
All right, we'll see you later.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.